Hello and welcome back to the August now. August, gosh, the time is going past quickly this summer, but the August edition of our residential experts with former CEO of Property Mark Hayward, just moving ambassador. How are you, Mark?
I'm cooler today than I have been, but no, well, thank you.
Yes, it's been unbearably hot. I actually lost the ability to think at some point in the afternoon. A couple of weeks ago, it was horrendous. And in fact, that's probably the first thing that we should talk about, really. Climate is obviously changing, or seems to be changing. And we're going to get more heat waves like this. So how is this going to affect the housing market? Or how is it going to affect how we build houses and things like that?
Well, I think the recent heat wave has just sort of exacerbated the problem, and the problem has been there and has been raised relatively lately in the past as to an issue, particularly with new build properties, which are hugely thermally efficient, but they're built to keep the houses warm, not to keep the houses cool. And I know some occupants in flatted developments where windows don't even open have been finding it completely unbearable. So I think the government is going to have to look at the requirements for what new homes are built and how they're constructed. We don't think that air conditioning is probably the right solution because it's terribly energy inefficient. It needs to be something, whether you can look at in properties sort of a reversible heat pump, but again, that's got quite a large cost to it, or whether the thermal dynamics of a property are altered. And normally we'd look always north to see how houses are being kept warm in Scandinavia, etc. But now perhaps we're going to have to look south to see how properties in the future can be reflective of what is undeniably climate change.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult. I guess there are two issues here, aren't there? There's what we can do with existing housing stock, what people out there can do to keep their houses cool. And then the second issue, of course, is what we can do from a planning perspective with houses that are being built in the future. And I know that the government is now introducing what was it again? Part O of the building regulations. It's a new thing there where developers aren't particularly happy about this because they think they're going to have to go back to the drawing board with some of the houses that they've already had architects draw up. So it's very tricky. I mean, for people out there watching this that are trying to keep their homes cool and don't necessarily have a lot of money to spend, I mean, what can we suggest? Just things like shutters and keeping the curtains closed.
So if you look at Southern Europe, shutters are closed virtually all day. You don't allow doors to be open, windows to be open. You keep it very, very cool. Sadly, you keep it very, very dark. Not a lot we can do with existing stock except for sort of draw the curtains.
Yes, yeah.
Or the blinds, or whatever you may have, the sales of fans has gone through the roof. But all a fan does is just recirculates the hot air around the room or around the house. It doesn't actually cool it in any way.
Yeah, and I mean our housing stock isn't particularly well suited either, is it? Just like our homes aren't very well insulated. If you are going to put in air conditioning into an old house that's all very drafty, it's probably not going to be that efficient anyway.
No, I mean, bizarrely, probably the very old housing stock is probably better in hot weather than new. It's not very good for cold weather either, but, if it's a stone property, it doesn't change much in temperature inside from December to August, but the majority.
Yeah, I mean, how many stone houses are out there? Probably not that many. I don't know off the top of my head. My parents actually live in a stone property, and it's all very cool in there throughout the year, apart from in their conservatory, which is unbearable at all times if you get. The actual house itself is okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, this is a serious problem. I mean, I think in 2 years ago in 2020, about 2,500 people died as a result of the heat wave, and it's going to be worse this time. So it'll be interesting to see what the government does. And also there's a subsidence risk, isn't there? If we have long...
yeah, you have subsidence. So when a property moves, it's either heave or subsidence. So if it gets wet and it's a clay soil, it rises up. If it becomes hot, it shrinks. And of course, if there are any trees or large bushes, etc., nearby, they draw the water out. So, yep, it's a problem. So insurance premiums will probably go up to reflect that. And I suppose, you know, we've had our leadership race. We will know in September who the new Prime Minister is. They've all made, those that were contenders and the two that have been successful have made great claims about what they want to do with the housing market. None of it's particularly new. You know, it's build on brownfield house sites, build more houses. I think one was talking about modular houses being built, although one of the major developers has just recently closed its modular housing division because it's too expensive. And it's a bit like your point earlier about developers, they look to profit. So anything that's going to increase the building cost of land that they've already bought, so the price is fixed, is going to mean that they will have to put the prices of new homes up to reflect that. And at the moment, they seem to be able to, I won't say get away with it, but because the housing stock on the market is very low, new homes are selling at a premium. So that may well have to continue.
It'll be interesting as well to see what effect all this has on commercial buildings as well, because if you take a walk through London, all the new buildings are just made from glass, and you know, they're just like greenhouses.
But commercial buildings tend to be air conditioned. And I think when the recent house wave started, the number of people returning to their office increased quite substantially because it was cooler there than their own home. I mean, I wouldn't have fancied commuting particularly in that sort of way, but no, commercial buildings can have to look at the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well we'll leave that one there for now, and hopefully everyone's cool by the time they're watching this. So just moving on to our next subject today, it's something that was published on the Just Move In blog a couple of weeks ago, and that is about whether we should have auction-style sales packs for all properties. So property is marketed through and sold through estate agents as well. This is something you've mentioned very briefly in previous discussions that we've had. Yeah, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, you or I can buy a house today at auction. We don't even need to have seen it, but the legal pack and everything that a purchaser requires, searches, etc., is already done and it's there in a standardized form for them to see. Okay, it takes time to prepare, and that's one of the arguments against extending this to private treaty. But we know National Trading Standards for estate agents has already increased the requirement for statutory information, material information to be provided on agents' particulars. We know that, and we've spoken about it before, that the time it takes for a house, once the sale is agreed, to get to exchanging contracts is just getting worse. You know, 18, 90, 20 weeks or more. It needs to be grasped. Before they talked about, well, agents and lawyers need to sort this problem out together, but you know, you put agents and lawyers in a room, it's not always good. And when I started putting them all in a room together, not only did I discover that agents and lawyers don't always get on, but lawyers and lawyers don't always get on. But something's got to be done. It's a huge amount of time. It increases the cost. There's been lots of attempts to produce a standardized sellers pack, but that's voluntary. We did HIPs.
Yes, I was going to talk about those.
Today, unfortunately, the Tories abolished HIPs. The word HIPs is sort of banned at DLUC or DCLG, as it used to be called, but that would satisfy or solve a lot of the problems that we now have. You know, you had a home inspector that went out and took all the details down, did all that, did a condition report, which we don't have, which you don't actually have on a auction particular. But again, that would help if there's a condition report. It's similar to the home report that they have up in Scotland. All right, it's not a full report, but at least it helps them. So yeah, I would particularly be in favour of it, but I think it needs to be mandatory rather than let's all try to work together to make this happen, and it's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, I guess opponents of this idea would say, well, you know, anything that increases the number of hoops that sellers have to jump through, it is not a good thing, and it might encourage people not to list. But the problem with that, of course, is that we've got to encourage people to buy, and so it's kind of which way around does it go? And I guess people could point to the problems with HIPs and say, well, that proves that anything that's adding red tape will have a detrimental effect. But then HIPs themselves were flawed, weren't they? It was almost like a watered down version of what was required.
Yeah, when it actually came through, they'd taken out the mandatory condition report. As you say, it was watered down. It really didn't, in terms of buyers, seem to have much value, and it delayed it a bit. There was a whole industry that grew around it, but it can be done. It just means, and okay, sellers might not like it, but most sellers are also buyers. Yeah. Apart from time buyers, and again, on first time buyers, it would help them. It's all there. They're a vulnerable group. They haven't done it before, and everything is there for them, and they don't understand the delays or why there is a delay. I was going to say they don't understand the complexities, because actually moving, the legal process for moving a house isn't complex. It's just drawn out, and then you have a number of parties within the process. You have buyer and seller, you have buyer and seller's lawyers, you have a lender involved, you may have some surveyors involved. So there's a load of points that have to be drawn in for it to go through.
Well, it just seems to me that, I mean, it's such fundamental information, stuff that you get in a property information form and a fixtures and fittings form. They're telling you what's included in the sale. And you wouldn't go and buy a second-hand car, would you, without the service record? So surely this information should be provided up front, and most people know about their property off the top of their head, so it wouldn't take too long for them to do.
They're not people, the psyche of, they're not even thinking about it. They don't even, perhaps they might now ask what the EPC rating is on a property, but actually that's not a fundamental reason why they will buy or not buy a property. But if you go back to that car analogy, you wouldn't, you'd always ask what the MPG is on a car, what's the servicing cost, how long does it, when does it have to be serviced, etc., etc. And yet the cost, whilst it's high, is nothing like buying a house. And particularly at the moment when we've got energy costs going through not just the roof but the stratosphere, people should be looking at that. And I suppose again on the EPC it affects the renting side as well, where people are locked in. But going back to your original question, yes, let's make it completely transparent, mandatory, and accepted by all, to make the house moving and selling process speedy. Amen.
I agree. Well, the next topic of conversation that I wanted to introduce is obviously the cost of living crisis is still ongoing. We've heard that energy bills are going to go up again dramatically in October, which is obviously going to hit a lot of people hard in the pocket. And we also know that rents are still rising at a high rate. It's been the case for a while. So therefore, is it time that we start talking about rent caps?
Oh, rent caps. Well, the Mayor of London is in favour of rent caps. If you go on the continent, places like Germany have had rent caps for a long time. They also have a more secure legal system for tenants that protects them in more ways than just rent controls. I suppose the problem with the rent control is it inhibits investment in housing unless you can cap the cost at a fixed rate for a long period of time. If you are either a professional landlord, housing association, or a buy-to-let purchaser. We know they talked about it a lot in Scotland. Northern Ireland's getting towards that way. We know the government perceives the word landlord as being wicked, and it's not. They're not good people, well, as we all know that the majority are. In one way, I would be against it because I think it would have unintended consequences
Yes.
with exiting the landlords exiting the market and having less stock available. But if there was some way of building in to any tenancy an affordable increase or a fixed term more than the 6-month AST, that would probably be a good thing.
Yeah, I think that the history of rent control in this country, I mean, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but they were rent controls were sort of abolished about three or four decades ago, and the experience was that a lot of landlords left the market. Housing stock in the private rental sector went down considerably, and so anything, I guess, that could persuade landlords to leave the sector again at this point, where we already have a massive shortage of property, would sound like a bit of a risk to me.
I think it would be a risk, as we've said before. Landlords are perceiving the market is still very buoyant. House prices are rising as our rents are rising. So should I exit now and cash in? So no, I think you have to look at what the sentiment for the landlords just as well as the tenants. And of course, the tenants really don't have much of a representation, whereas the landlords are quite a powerful group. Yeah,
I mean, it'd be difficult to know, the term, if they did implement rent caps, how they would do it. I know that they have a model in Sweden where in the private rental sector, rents are only allowed to be 5% more than they are in social housing. Whether they could do something like that here, it's tricky to know how they would do it if they decided to do it.
Yeah, and at the moment, and I know it's in the renters reform proposals, but we have landlords are in effect unregulated, unidentifiable. So you've got to bring all those in before actually you will have the ability to control.
Yeah, I guess the landlords have so much on there. I mean, we keep coming back to this, don't we? That landlords feel somewhat under siege at the moment, don't they? And this is going to feel like another kick in the teeth. If they're having to make improvements in their properties to improve its EPC and things like that, and yet at the same time they're told that rents need to be controlled. It's a bit of a tough gig, isn't
it? It probably doesn't add up, does it? Financially, it's not good. You'd then just be relying upon capital growth as an incentive, but capital growth is not guaranteed.
Yeah, and of course, all of this in the background are that a lot of tenants need a lot of help. I was reading the other day that I think that Shelter define rent as unaffordable if you're spending a third of your monthly income on rent. Well, there's a lot of people, particularly in London, who are paying a lot more than that, maybe paying half.
Statistically, they're paying over half their take-home pay, whereas a mortgage borrower is probably at 30-something%, because they're only allowed to borrow so much.
So landlords have got it tough, tenants have got it tough. Whoever walks into number 10 in September is going to have a rather tough brief to sort all of this out.
I think they are, and we'll have to see what their priorities are. Watch that. That frequently vacated space.
Yes, and that kind of is a nice segue into my next question, which is that obviously we've talked a lot about the Renters Reform Bill, but now with Michael Gove exiting the building, Boris Johnson exiting the building, we've now got Greg Clark is filling the breach, at least for now. Do you think that all of these twists and turns at at Westminster may impact whether the Renters Reform Bill is going to actually happen?
Well, we know that Michael Gove pushed for it because it was a notch on his belt, so to speak. We know that, and he was the Secretary of State, we know that Eddie Hughes, who's the Housing Minister, particularly for the rental sector, is still in post. From recent conversations with officials, I know they're continuing to work at the same pace on the Renters Reform Bill. And I know that at the end of July, the Levelling Up Committee, not the Department, but the Levelling Up Committee, announced that they were looking at the draft bill and seeking responses via a consultation. So at the moment, it's still proceeding, but we've known, for years that, for instance, the regulation of property agents is still proceeding, but we don't actually get to a culmination of those proceedings and actually mandatory legal enforcement. But
yeah, and then a general election in a couple of years' time, we could have a completely new government. We might even have a coalition government of some form in 2 years, and they'll have their own ideas.
And that sort of, is housing political or personal? I mean, it's personal, but it is used as a political tool.
Yeah, I mean, do you think all of these changes have a detrimental effect on the property sector per se, or do you think that the sector is quite robust and used to it now?
I think those that operate in the sector are used to it and pretty robust. It is the consumer that isn't either aware, whether they're buyers, sellers, tenants, or landlords sometimes, actually what is going on, what's on the horizon, what needs to be on the horizon. So, but it doesn't generally affect the market. But of course, if something like rent controls came in or increased taxation, we know when the increased stamp duty came through on second properties, and other measures that, the buy-to-let landlord ran for the hills. There was a huge amount of sales, so it can affect it. It's always difficult to actually decide and discern what affects a market, because a lot of it is about sentiment. How do people feel? Not what's down there in black and white, but how do people feel? And perhaps going back to your previous comments, we've got the cost of living is rising and is going to continue to rise. There does come a point where things are unaffordable.
Yeah. Tough times, I think, and interesting times as well.
Yeah. We're not being depressing, we're just being realistic.
Yeah, definitely. Well, for the final thing I wanted to talk to you today, and I think you were kind of sort of going towards it a little bit there, is you've talked to me in the past about what you call property soup.
Yes.
And I just wanted you to explain what you mean by that, because it's quite interesting hearing you talk about it.
Well, when I talk about property soup, it's because I've been giving some thought to the market, and before we have these sorts of sessions, and actually trying to draw in some of the things that will affect the market moving forward. Most agents setting up business, lettings or sales, will just look at, what's the available stock, what's going to happen. But what we're not looking at is, and this is why I call it, let's throw everything in. We're not looking at mortality rates. We're not looking necessarily at the number of houses that have to be built in the next 10 years, when we've got new households going to increase by 1.6 million before 2030. We've got a housing population that's increasing because more people want it. We've got people living longer, so therefore houses at the top. We've got first-time buyers who are finding it increasingly difficult to buy. We've still got this north-south shift, and it's something we really need to look at, because housing isn't 6 months ahead, it's not 2 years ahead, it's not 3 years ahead, it's 10, 20, 30 years ahead. What's going to happen to all these people who are sat in rented accommodation when they retire? They're not going to have that capital to rely on. And again, on that retirement issue, normally we would see people retire, at an earlier stage and sell their property. That's not happening. The baby boomers, just coming to an end, I speak from experience, are not selling. And they're not also passing down equity, in effect, to their children. So there's a problem. We've got 3-4 countries, all doing different, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, all doing slightly different things. And I think we've really got to try and put something together that, or really start to think about it in terms of research, to sort of extrapolate what's going to happen and why, because it's not just going to be about mortgage rates are low, then loans are easy to get, or they're building more houses. Well, they're not building more houses because they don't want to erode the profit.
Yeah.
And look at other countries where, should we be talking about multi-generational living, where we're all, grandparents, parents, children all live in the same property and just move around that property as their age changes. We talked briefly about modular houses. There's loads of things to throw into this soup, hopefully that end up making it palatable.
I guess what makes it difficult is that the chef's only there in 5-year stints, and the nature of our democracy is that
if that, and someone they like to tweak it, but it's trying to look at everything that would affect it. Well, there are a lot of researchers out there doing it, but are they doing it correctly, and are they doing it for a long period of time in terms of viewpoint moving forward?
Yeah, so it's about people taking a view, sort of a 20, 30, 40-year view, but of course governments are only ever interested in the next election, I guess, but
correct.
Maybe there needs to be some sort of cross-bench agreement, I don't know.
And individually, consumers, they buy a property, they think they're only going to be there for 7-10 years. 25 years later, they're still there. That is already changing, but what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, indeed, it's interesting stuff, and maybe we'll leave it there with that sort of question hanging in the air, and perhaps we'll touch again on this at some point in the future. Yeah, so let's wrap things up for this month, for August, and we'll talk again in September. Are you off anywhere interesting on your holidays?
I'm off to Europe, so France. So providing I can get there, it should be okay. Should be okay. We'll
have a nice time, and we'll reconvene in a month. Thanks very much for your time, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining us as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.